Imagine waking up in a house you have lived in for 10 years. You know every creak of the floorboards. You know the exact sound the wind makes when it hits your bedroom window. You know your neighbors, your friends, and the quiet streets of your neighborhood. You feel safe. But what if I told you that safety was an illusion? What if I told you that the people living right next door, the people you smile at every single morning, were hiding a secret so dark it would tear a whole community apart? Today, we are looking at a case that recently surfaced, a story so deeply unsettling, local authorities tried to bury the details to prevent mass panic. If you think you know how far someone will go to keep a secret, think again. Because by the end of this video, everything you thought you knew about trust, family, and safety is going to change. This is the story of the Bennett family. To the outside world, they were the absolute definition of the American dream. They lived in the quiet, affluent suburbs of Oakridge, Pennsylvania. It was the kind of town where doors were left unlocked. The kind of town where crime was just a word you heard on the evening news. Arthur Bennett was a respected financial advisor. His wife, Eleanor, was a beloved elementary school teacher. They had 2 teenage children, a golden retriever and a beautifully manicured lawn. They were completely, perfectly ordinary. But underneath that flawless surface, a complex and terrifying web was being woven in the dark. And on the night of October 14th, that web finally snapped. It was a Tuesday. The weather was brutal. A massive rainstorm had rolled into Oakridge, knocking out the power grid for the eastern side of the town. The streets were pitch black. The wind was howling. At exactly 2:14 a.m., the local 911 dispatch center received a call. The operator answered, asking the nature of the emergency. But there was no frantic screaming. There were no demands for police or an ambulance. For a long, agonizing 10 seconds, there was only the sound of heavy, shaky breathing. The operator asked again, assuming it was a prank or a misdial. Then, a man's voice whispered a single, chilling sentence into the receiver. He said, "They didn't leave. They are still in the walls." Then, the line went dead. The call was traced to the Bennett residence. Within 8 minutes, Officer Marcus Thorne pulled his cruiser into their driveway. The red and blue lights slashed through the heavy rain, illuminating a house that looked completely undisturbed from the outside. No broken windows. No forced entry. The front door was actually locked. Officer Thorne knocked loudly, announcing his presence. He waited. Nothing but the sound of the rain. He walked around to the back of the house, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The back patio door was standing wide open, banging violently against the siding in the wind. Thorne drew his weapon and stepped inside. What he found inside that house would haunt him for the rest of his career. The house was empty. But it wasn't just empty of people. It was entirely stripped of its history. Every single family photograph in the living room had been meticulously removed from its frame. The frames themselves were perfectly placed back on the shelves and the walls, but the pictures were gone. Thorne moved into the kitchen. The oven was still on. A roast was burning inside, filling the room with a thick, acrid smoke. On the counter sat Arthur's wallet, completely untouched. Eleanor's purse was resting on a kitchen chair. Their cell phones were sitting side by side on the kitchen island. He moved upstairs, his heart pounding in his chest. The children's bedrooms were immaculate. The beds were made, but the closets were entirely empty. Not a single piece of clothing remained. By sunrise, the house was surrounded by yellow police tape. Detectives swarmed the property. The initial theory was a bizarre home invasion or a kidnapping. But seasoned investigators quickly realized the pieces simply did not fit together. Kidnappers do not take the time to remove family photos from their frames. Intruders do not make the beds before taking an entire family hostage. And the vehicles were both still parked securely in the garage. The Bennetts had not been taken. They had vanished into thin air. For the first 48 hours, the police scoured the surrounding woods. They brought in tracking dogs. The dogs picked up the family's scent at the back door, followed it across the wet grass, and then stopped abruptly at the edge of the property line. It was as if the family had simply evaporated. Investigators began knocking on doors. They spoke to every neighbor on the block. Everyone said the exact same thing. The Bennetts were lovely people. They were quiet. They kept to themselves, but they were always polite. However, as the detectives dug deeper, the pristine image of Arthur and Eleanor Bennett began to crack. The neighbor directly across the street, an elderly man named Mr. Henderson, mentioned something odd. He told detectives that for the past 6 months, a massive, unmarked white van would park at the end of the street every Thursday at exactly 3 a.m. It would sit there for 20 minutes and then drive away. He had assumed it was a strange delivery route. Another neighbor, Mrs. Gable, reluctantly shared a strange interaction she had with Eleanor just 2 days before the disappearance. She had run into Eleanor at the local grocery store. Eleanor looked exhausted, pale, and incredibly nervous. When Mrs. Gable asked if she was feeling okay, Eleanor grabbed her arm tightly, leaned in, and whispered, "If we leave, do not look for us. Promise me you won't look." The detectives were baffled. Why would a beloved school teacher say something like that? The investigation shifted from a search and rescue mission to a deep background check. The police pulled Arthur's financial records. They expected to find massive debts, a gambling problem, or perhaps a hidden mistress. Instead, they found absolutely nothing. And I mean nothing. Arthur's bank accounts had zero history before the year 2018. The house, worth nearly $1 million, had been purchased in cash through a blind trust. The detectives ran Arthur and Eleanor's social security numbers through the federal database. The system flagged both numbers immediately. The social security numbers belonged to 2 infants who had died in a hospital in Texas in 1982. Arthur and Eleanor Bennett did not exist. The names were fabricated. The marriage certificate was a highly sophisticated forgery. The children's birth certificates were fake. The entire life they had built in Oakridge was a carefully constructed theater. The town was thrown into chaos. The media caught wind of the fake identities, and the story exploded. The quiet, boring Bennetts were actually phantoms. But who were they really? Were they in witness protection? Were they foreign spies? The FBI took over the case. They ripped the house apart, searching for any clue, any hidden safe, any scrap of paper that would reveal their true identities. For 3 weeks, they found nothing. The house was a dead end. But then, a breakthrough happened, and it came from the most unlikely place. A hiker, walking through a dense state park 50 miles away from Oakridge, spotted something reflecting in the mud near a riverbed. It was a metal lockbox, heavily dented and covered in dirt. Inside the box was a single, encrypted hard drive. The hard drive was handed over to the FBI Cyber Division. It took them 2 weeks of nonstop work to bypass the military-grade encryption. When they finally opened the files, the entire investigative team went dead silent. The drive did not belong to Arthur. It belonged to Eleanor. Eleanor Bennett, the sweet, smiling elementary school teacher, was not a teacher at all. The files on the drive contained highly classified blueprints of municipal power grids across the East Coast. There were hundreds of folders filled with wiretapped conversations. But these weren't conversations of politicians or criminals. They were the phone calls of their neighbors. Eleanor had been surveilling the entire town of Oakridge. She had audio recordings of Mr. Henderson talking to his daughter. She had bank records of Mrs. Gable. She had the daily schedules of every single person living within a 5-mile radius of her home. The Bennetts weren't hiding from the town. They were studying the town. Oakridge was an experiment, and Eleanor was the lead researcher. But the most terrifying discovery on that hard drive was a video file, simply titled The Exit. The FBI agents gathered around the monitor and clicked play. The video was dated October 14th, just hours before the bizarre 911 call. The footage was shot from a camera mounted high in the corner of the Bennett's living room. It showed the family sitting on the couch, but they weren't panicking. They were calmly packing black duffel bags. Arthur looked directly into the camera. He didn't look like a terrified father. He looked cold, calculated, and entirely devoid of emotion. He spoke clearly into the microphone. Phase 2 is compromised. They found the blind spots in the house. We are initiating the protocol. Suddenly, the video showed something that made the FBI agents freeze in horror. The heavy oak bookshelf in the corner of the living room slowly swung open on hidden hinges. Behind it wasn't a wall. It was a dark, narrow tunnel leading straight down into the earth. The family picked up their bags, walked into the tunnel one by one, and pulled the bookshelf shut behind them. The police rushed back to the Bennett house. They tore apart the living room. They found the hidden latch. They swung the bookshelf open. The tunnel was there. It was lined with concrete and went down for 30 feet before leveling out. The tactical team descended with flashlights and drawn weapons. They expected to find a bunker. They expected to find a command center. Instead, the tunnel led directly out to a storm drain, a quarter of a mile away from the house, completely bypassing the police perimeter. The tracking dogs had lost the scent at the property line because the family was walking directly underneath them. But the tunnel wasn't empty. Nailed to the concrete wall right at the exit of the storm drain was a single photograph. It was one of the family photos that had been removed from the living room frames. But the faces of Arthur, Eleanor, and the kids were heavily crossed out with a black marker. Written in red ink across the bottom of the photo were the words, "We told you not to look." The 911 call about people living in the walls wasn't a terrified cry for help. It was a distraction. It was designed to pull the police directly to the house, to lock down the perimeter, to make everyone look at the shiny distraction while the real magic trick happened right beneath their feet. To this day, the true identities of the people calling themselves the Bennetts remain unknown. The FBI sealed the contents of the hard drive, classifying it under national security. The house in Oakridge was quietly demolished 3 months later, and the land was paved over. The neighbors don't talk about it anymore. Mr. Henderson moved away. Mrs. Gable refuses to give interviews. The town went back to being quiet, boring, and beautiful. But the question remains, who were they working for? What were they looking for in that quiet little town? And most terrifying of all, where did they go? If a highly trained surveillance team can seamlessly integrate into a neighborhood, fake their identities, tap the phones of everyone on the block, and then vanish without a single trace, how well do you really know the people living next door to you right now? Think about the neighbor you wave to in the morning, the one who keeps their blinds pulled just a little too tight, the one whose background seems just a little too perfect. Are they really who they say they are? Or are they just watching you, waiting for phase 2? Let me know what you think about this bizarre case in the comments below. Do you think they were government operatives or something far more sinister? If you found this story as chilling as I did, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into the unknown. Stay safe out there, keep your eyes open, and I will see you in the next video.